All right, who are the Zizians? From the Baltimore Sun, the group arrested in Western Maryland had ties to violence across the country, but experts largely stop short of calling group a cult. So, this is by Christine Condon. Let's see what we can learn about the Zizians. There was an arrest in Western Maryland last weekend of 3 people known as Zizians, which brought renewed attention to this small group, which preaches obscure ideas about the human mind and is tied to a string of killings across the country. But whether they're viewed as a cult, as some have branded the group, depends on whom you ask. Oh, great. Let's get into the subtleties of whether this group is a cult. Most scholars eschew the term cult altogether, given that it carries a host of negative stereotypes. Well, you'd hate to negatively stereotype a group tied to murders across the country, right? Experts say the group is best described as a fringe religious sect, an affinity group, or maybe even a small gang. Okay. This is semantics, isn't it? Their story, known to law enforcement and victims' families in several states, hit Maryland on Monday when police arrested 3 Zizians in Frostburg on trespassing, obstruction, and gun possession charges. An area resident, noting what he deemed as suspicious behavior, contacted the police. Those arrested included Jack Lasota, a 34-year-old computer programmer who goes by the name Ziz and appears to lead the small group. The others were Michelle Zazko of Media, Pennsylvania, and Daniel Arthur Blank of Sacramento. So 26, 32, and 34 years old, 3 Zizians that investigators have connected as a group to the January killing of a U.S. Border Patrol agent during a traffic stop in Vermont, as well as other homicides in California and Pennsylvania. So the group caught the attention of Mark Pitkovich, a senior research fellow with the Anti-Defamation League's Center on Extremism, after he learned of the Border Patrol agent's death. All right, so you have this ADL fellow, Mark Pitkovich, and he has been trying to figure out the Zizians at least since the death of the Border Patrol agent in Vermont. As far as he can tell, the Zizians are a loose group of 10 to 15 people connected to Lasota, that is Ziz, who seemingly took to the internet to share ideas about the human mind, veganism, and transgender people, among a host of other subjects. Pitkovich said he considers the Zizians a fringe religious sect, essentially an antagonistic offshoot of the rationalist movement, even though their beliefs may not sound religious and don't necessarily involve a higher power. There's a whole history of sects or movements like this that are seemingly secular in nature but are actually based on unprovable notions that you kind of have to take on faith. You mean like cults? No, I think I think it's true that, I mean, the human brain actually demands sacredness, right? Without sacredness, you don't have a orientation to your compass. You know, your mental compass needs something that is your true north. And so certainly many things can take on religious fervor. I mean, you could say any belief could become religious insofar as it can become sacred. It can become the defining notion. It can become the pure good by which you judge how good other things are, right? How much like this pure good are the things I'm encountering? The only way to know that is you have a pure good, right? So this group has some kind of sacred beliefs. That's what I'm getting so far. The Zizian beginnings and a turn to violence. The saga seems to begin in the mid-2010s with Lasota, a transgender woman who uses feminine pronouns. That's Ziz, okay, attending workshops in California held by a rationalist group, the Center for Applied Rationality, which focuses on human cognition and espouses concerns on its website that artificial intelligence could pose an existential risk. All right, the Center for Applied Rationality. Developing clear thinking for the sake of humanity's future. Seems like a reasonable goal. I would like clear thinking for the sake of our species' future. They have workshops, 4.5-day immersive retreats. I wonder if they're getting a ton of traffic right now, right? navigating intellectual disagreement, making better use of our internal advisors, developing non-self-deceptive motivation, and building the habit of getting things done. All right, sure. I'm curious about internal advisors, but I like building the habit of getting things done. I like non-self-deceptive motivation, certainly. Forming accurate beliefs. How do you do it? I guess you have to go to the workshop. Let's see. About. Their last update was in December 2020. Hello, we continue to exist. Well, is that is that the latest or just the most popular one? No, I think that's the latest. Well, kind of need another update, I think, on that. See, the problem is if I like to get things from the source. If I go to Wikipedia, you don't know if you're getting some kind of third-hand interpretation. Whenever you can get a primary source, that's what you should use. So I'd like to get some kind of direct insights into what rationalism is. Here's their reading list. From AI to Zombies. From 2015, all right. In Rationality from AI to Zombies, Eliezer Yudkowsky explains the science underlying human irrationality with a mix of fables, argumentative essays, and personal vignettes. These eye-opening accounts of how the mind works and how, too, all often, it doesn't, are then put to the test through some genuinely difficult puzzles. Computer scientists' debates about the future of artificial intelligence, physicists' debates about the relationship between the quantum and classical worlds, philosophers' debates about the metaphysics of zombies and the nature of morality, and many more. All right. So, I mean, what's the point? What's the point? Lasota remained involved with the center for years, but over time the relationship grew more antagonistic as Lasota, Ziz, embraced more extreme ideas, Pitkovich said. Lasota believed that the two hemispheres of the brain were very separate. One might be trans, one might not be trans. One could be awake while the other is asleep. One could be good and one could be evil. It's true for dolphins that one can be awake while the other is asleep. But I would say for humans, we have pretty good evidence that there's constant communication between the corpus callosum and that the coordinated mental activity that's happening during the waking life is in fact correlated across both hemispheres, as is the different state of brain waves that you can see, say, on an EEG during sleep. Still, it has cross-hemispheric correlations, at least. So it seems to be coordinated, and it makes sense that it would be coordinated across the corpus callosum, which is a bunch of wires right in the middle of the brain. So, you know, that's not to say it's not possible that there's two identities, that there are sort of asymmetric areas of identity. That would not be evident from any of the imaging or other ways of measuring brain activity that we have. You know, electrophysiologic readings of brain activity are not really consistent with that. Now, some people have had the corpus callosum severed, and in those cases there is the phenomenon alien hand syndrome, where, you know, you can see videos that people that get this operation, it was used more often several decades ago. It was for refractory epilepsy, so patients that would have grand mal seizures despite any degree of drug treatment, they would still have these refractory grand mal seizures, and so the sort of last resort was to actually sever the corpus callosum, and in that case, if there is a seizure focus, it cannot generalize, it can no longer become grand mal. So that was the point of the corpus callosectomy. Now, in those patients, there was this phenomenon where the non-dominant hand would start sort of seeming to operate with its own will that was not conscious to the person. For example, the person would be writing something with a pen, and the left hand would come and take the pen out of the hand and throw it away, something like this. I remember seeing a video of a patient with this post-corpus colectomy alien hand syndrome, putting on a shirt and had to just button with the right hands, right? And then the left hand came and started unbuttoning the buttons. So that is quite a strange, albeit rare phenomenon, alien hand syndrome. But I would say that's more the exception that proves the rule. The reason that there is that alien hand syndrome is because the communication between hemispheres was severed. The dominant verbal hemisphere is now the one that the person is identifying with, right? We identify with the words that we tell ourselves in our heads. The words are in fact localized to the left brain, which controls the right hand. The right hemisphere, which controls the left hand and left side of the body, is nonverbal. And so in the case of severing all of the connections between the two hemispheres, yes, there is this sort of alien identity, but it's because the hemispheres were disconnected. So I don't think it makes sense that by default we should think of the hemispheres of the brain as being two separate identities. All right, in 2019, Lasota and 2 others were arrested at what they called a protest against sexual misconduct within rationalist organizations. You got that? Lasota Ziz was first connected to a violent incident in 2020 in Vallejo, California. Landowner Curtis Lind sought a court's approval to evict Lasota and several others from his property for non-payment of rent. The group had been living on the land in box trucks and vans. So this Curtis Lind, this was a guy that the group knew. They had met when they had been trying to live on a tugboat, I believe, prior to moving onto his land. He tried to evict them, and some portion of the group attacked him, impaled him with a sword, partially blinded him, and 2 of the group's members were charged, although Ziz was not charged at that time. Now, this landlord, Lind, survived the attack, but when he was due to testify against those attackers, right, his court date was coming up. He's the crucial witness. He's killed in an attack, right? Now, prosecutors have charged Maximilian Snyder and argued that Snyder was motivated by preventing Lind from testifying to commit this murder. Back to Maryland now. There were these 2 people arrested, Ziz Lasota and Michelle Zajko. Michelle Zajko was previously interviewed as a person of interest in the deaths of her parents, the Zajko parents, Rita and Richard, in Pennsylvania. Right, so you've got the death of the landlord in California. You've got the death of the Zajkos in Pennsylvania. You've got the death of the Border Patrol agent in Vermont. Police have said that a person of interest in the Zajko homicides in Pennsylvania also purchased one of the guns that was used in the Vermont Border Patrol agent shooting. Now, what had happened then, this was January 20th, Border Patrol agents had pulled Teresa Youngblood, who had applied for a marriage license with Maximilian Snyder. This is quite a web, right? So this Teresa Youngblood had been reported missing by her parents, was getting married to Maximilian Snyder, but here she is in Vermont getting pulled over with companion Felix, close to Canada, and a Border Patrol agent, David Mayland, ends up dead. Youngblood was charged. Felix Balcault also died in that shoot-off, and so Youngblood is charged in the shooting, with the implication being she shot at the Border Patrol agent who returned fire, and it resulted in the deaths of both David Mayland, the Border Patrol agent, and Felix Balcault. So, a gang, a religion, or a, quote, affinity group. The revelations about the Ziz group sparked a debate on an electronic mailing list for religious scholars, said Jeremy Rapport, an associate professor of religious studies at the College of Worcester in Ohio. Wow, so we get some insider information about a lively debate on a email list for religious scholars? Aren't we lucky? There are people on this listserv who would definitely say, sure, this is the same sort of fringe religious movement that we've seen in fits and starts throughout American history. Rappert said, I don't know if Rappert said, there's all kinds of small movements that do extremely unconventional, sometimes silent things, sometimes with sort of a figure of religion. But other scholars on the email chain argued that the group seemed closer to a gang. Rappert said, it's not really steeped in any sort of coherent religious or meaning-making system per se, and it's just kind of a flash in the pan, Rappert said. They did something violent, and now everyone's paying attention. Academics who study new religions generally don't use the term cult because it has a very negative connotation attached, as well as stereotypes that may not hold true for the group in question, said J. Gordon Melton, a retired distinguished professor of American religious history at Baylor University. Whenever you use that term, you don't like whatever you're labeling this group with, Melton said. So essentially it says more about the speaker than about the people who are being labeled. So fair point that if you're calling a group a cult, you're basically saying you don't like them or don't trust them. Except if that were true, how would I talk about the band Blue Oyster Cult? I love them. No, I get what he's saying, but that's basically to sort of say we can never use the word cult again, right? If you can't call any new religious group a cult, then the word cult has basically gone into obsolescence, right? Otherwise, what are we talking about when we talk about a cult? Though many exist, most Americans would never find out about these obscure groups with strange belief systems unless something brings them into the spotlight. Sure. As far as the Ziz group, Melton said he considers them something closer to an affinity group which shares a common interest but doesn't appear to be linked by a clear structure or coherent set of beliefs. But the group is calling themselves Zizians, are they not? They're the Ziz group, and there's one individual who has gone by the name Ziz, right? In this case, it's just a bad informal set of friends who influence each other and made bad decisions, Melton said. But Melton cautioned that little is known about the Zizians. Oh, I thought we were going to learn about the Zizians. And revelations during the legal process could change the way the group is characterized. One of the real problems with the group is we don't know much about them. Why did I sign up for a Baltimore Sun subscription today? Once these people are looked at over a period of time, we don't know how much this first week of reporting will stand up. So really, I was hoping for a link to the blog or something like this. Where's the Zizian blog? Sinceriously.fyi. Sinceriously.fyi has been deemed not to be safe. I've got to get back to safety. Man. Okay. Here's a rationalist. I guess this is a mirror, all right, of the Sinceriously blog. So I want to look at some of this. I want to look at some of these beliefs. But first, I want to talk about delusions, okay? If we take someone like Ziz and we take the Zizians, I imagine that they have ardent beliefs. I imagine that whatever you want to call them, the affinity that they have is for a certain collection of beliefs or a cluster of beliefs, some of which are more important to some members than others, but regardless, beliefs that have a certain zeal to them, right? Now, as a psychiatrist, I do want to say it's important that we distinguish between the content of a belief and the structure of a belief, particularly when we're talking about delusions. And the reason for that is I do not think that psychiatrists or any individual should be the arbiter of objective truth, right? And that's not to say that I don't believe in objective truth. I happen to believe in it, but that's just like my opinion, man. But I wouldn't trust any human individual to be the arbiter of what is true. In other words, if someone believes something, whatever it is, if they believe that aliens have left messages for them in archaeological structures, aliens have left messages, and this person believes that they know what the messages mean. I'm not going to say you are delusional because of the mere belief content itself, right? I don't know whether aliens left messages and whether this individual is interpreting them correctly. For my purposes, it becomes a delusion when it is clearly interfering with functioning or when the structure of it is indicating a breakdown in the mind's functioning. So long as this individual can explain the belief to me in a logical and linear sense, I'm going to say the structure is okay. Okay? Now, if in the explanation, the individual starts putting words together that don't function grammatically or logically together, if they degenerate into word salad when they're trying to describe it, I'm going to say this now sounds like a breakdown of logic. This is nonlinear. This is tangential thinking, etc. And the delusion is going to be treated more like a clinical problem, right? Something to treat now. The other possibility is that it's not the structure of the belief itself, but it's the manifestations of the belief in the person's life. So if the person insists on charging through cordoned off areas of a tourist attraction, if they are actually beating up security guards to be able to get a closer look at whatever sort of archaeological site because they believe it's important enough for them to see up close this message that the aliens left for them, then I would say that that then is a sign of a delusion as well, right? So Peters et al. Talked about delusions as having a certain level of preoccupation, distress, and conviction. One or multiple of those factors is what is going to ultimately define the delusion. It's the level of distress it's causing the person, right? It may be that the belief itself is not bizarre, but the level of distress is out of proportion to the belief, right? I mean, things like being spied on, we're all being spied on, but probably, right? At this point, you gotta think a lot of your activity is in some sense being watched. Now that has been a paranoid belief for a long time, or it's been a belief that has shown up in paranoid people. But what makes them paranoid is not merely thinking I'm being spied on, it's that they cannot function because of the distress from this belief, right? They're tearing their walls apart. They're in just a horrible emotional state, right? So that's why it's a paranoid delusion, not because of what the belief is, okay? The other's preoccupation. So again, preoccupation is sort of like distress, but it gets at the continuity of thought, the fact that you can't let it go. If you're spending your entire day thinking about something, likely you're not enjoying life. You're not able to sort of do the things that Freud defined as defining mental health, right? Leben et Arbeiten, or Leben und Arbeiten, to work and to love. If you can't sort of function, if you can't do something meaningful or have meaningful relationships because you're so preoccupied with a belief, whatever it is, that might be a sign of a delusion, right? And then the last being conviction. So if the belief is so resistant to evidence, to updated information from the environment, if anything that happens to the person is reinterpreted, illogically reinterpreted as actually supporting the belief, when a general consensus would be that this is evidence to the contrary, right? So for example, the flat earth belief, maybe you've seen the videos of the strong sort of flat earth advocates carrying out these tests for the curvature of the earth, and in a kind of beautiful way, right? So sometimes we see that they do the experiment, they do it authentically and correctly, and the results are consistent with the curvature of the earth. The person then has two options. One is to say, I'm going to update my belief. I think the earth is curved. Whatever else I believe, there's some curvature, otherwise the light would have been, 8 feet higher or whatever. The other option is to say, this is some kind of trick of light. Someone actually set up the bulb to be at the wrong angle from what we calculate. Who knows? At that point, it would be illogical, right? Because that would be too strong of a conviction. That would be a sort of inability to participate in like Bayesian belief updating, right? So again, the content of the belief should not define a delusion. The structure or the manifestations of the belief can be used in that sort of clinical sense. And the importance of saying this is because I don't think any of us want to live in a world where someone can say, merely based on what you believe, I'm going to lock you up, right? Not that we should be excessively holding people involuntarily in psychiatric units. Obviously, there's lots of safeguards that should be in place, but I definitely don't think we should be any less stringent about using a delusion, quote unquote, if it's just a belief to say that someone needs to have a mandatory 72-hour hold or be involuntarily committed, that kind of thing. I'm sure you can imagine how various political movements could use that in a very dangerous way, right? No matter what side of the aisle you're on, right? Okay. Neutral and evil. This was written by Ziz. So, all right, I just picked one at random here from the Sinceriously blog. This is Neutral and Evil, written by Ziz, December 29th, 2017. What is the good, neutral, evil axis of Dungeons & Dragons alignment made of? We've got an idea of what it would mean for an AI to be good. It wants to make all the good things happen so much, and it does. But what's the difference between a neutral AI and an evil AI? It's tempting to say that the evil AI is malevolent rather than just indifferent, and the neutral one is indifferent. But that doesn't fit the intuitive idea that the alignment system was supposed to map onto, or what alignment is. So it sounds like basically talking about there's sort of a spectrum, like in Dungeons and Dragons, that things can be good, neutral, or evil. They can be chaotic. I don't know that much about Dungeons and Dragons, but good or not good, that's different than there being this neutral versus malevolent. Imagine a crime boss who makes a living off of the kidnapping and ransoms of random innocents while posting videos online of the torture and dismemberment of those whose loved ones don't pay up as encouragement, not because of sadism, but because they wanted money to spend on lots of shiny gold things they like and are indifferent to human suffering. Evil, right? If sufficient indifference can make someone evil, then if a good AI creates utopia and an AI that kills everyone and creates paperclips because it values only paperclips is evil, then what is a neutral aligned AI? What determines the exact middle ground between utopia and everyone being dead? I got to find a TLDR. I think you've got an intuitive idea of what a typical neutral human does. They live in their house with their white picket fence and have kids and grow old, and they don't go out of their way to right faraway wrongs in the world. But if they own a restaurant and the competition down the road starts attracting away their customers, and they are given a tour through the kitchens in the back, and they see a great opportunity to start a fire and disable the smoke detectors that won't be detected until it's too late, burning down the building and probably killing the owner, they don't do it. Okay, so this, according to Ziz, is a neutral person. Here's one issue. People are complicated, right? So, I mean, trying to say that every human being should be either good, neutral, or evil, I mean, people do many actions that are good and an occasional action that is evil oftentimes. And so what would you call that person? So I don't know why this entire essay seems to use the notion that the Dungeons and Dragons rule of morality, which is that everyone should fit into one of three categories, would hold true for things as complicated as humans and human technology. That's one of my issues so far. It's not that a neutral person values the life of their rival more than the additional money they'd make with the competition eliminated. It's not. So the reason someone wouldn't burn down their restaurant's competitor is not because they value that other restaurant owner's life more than the money they'd make from eliminating the competition. It's not because of that. Nor cares about better serving the populace with a better selection of food in the area, right? So they're not doing it because they want to make sure the population has the choice between the two restaurants. I would agree with that. That's not why they're doing it. You won't see them looking for opportunities to spend that much money or less to save anyone's life. Okay, so they're not going to go, at the same time, they're not going to go above and beyond to spend the amount of money they would have made here to save people's lives. Okay, and unless most humans are evil, which is as against the intuitive concept the alignment system points at as neutral equals indifference, it's not about action or inaction either. People eat meat, and I'm pretty sure most of them believe that animals have feelings. That's active harm, probably. Wait a minute, did I seriously just base a sweeping conclusion about what alignment means on an obscure piece of possible moral progress beyond the present day? What happened to all my talk about sticking to the intuitive concept? Well, I'm not sticking to the intuitive concept. I'm sticking to the real thing. And the intuitive concept I'm sticking to the real thing the intuitive concept pointed at, which gave it its worthiness of attention. I'm trying to improve on the intuitive thing. What's your point, Ziz? If you try poking at the structure most people build in their minds around morality, you'll see it's thoroughly fake and bent towards coordination, which appears to be ultimately for their own benefit. I don't want to spiral into all of these tendrils that I'm sure rationalism has. I just want to try to get a sort of single gestalt from this one essay for now. Okay, so what is the answer Ziz would give to the question of whether becoming a sociopath makes you evil? No, from the perspective of you're evil if you're complicit in an evil social structure, because then you probably already were. So I think Ziz is saying that you can be a sociopath in an evil society, right? Which is a useful perspective for coordinating to enact justice. So I think Ziz is saying it's useful for people to realize that they're not being evil, even if they're being sociopathic if they're in an evil social structure. And so this is this sort of revolutionary spirit. This is, it's not madness to be mad in a mad world or whatever, right? But what I'm always more concerned with what people's own definition of good is. It's easy to come up with definitions of evil, in my opinion, or to excuse evil. It's hard to come up with what is an absolute good. Right? If you're reading this and this is you, i.e., being in an evil social structure and realizing it, Ziz recommends aiming for lawful evil. Keep a strong focus on still being able to coordinate, even though you know that's what you're doing. All right, look, I'm going to admit this is going to necessarily be a very superficial read from me. I get the sense that there's a lot of pre-reading that would be necessary to sort of build this house of beliefs. I think it takes a certain amount of understanding the true nature of what coordination means and things like this. Let's see if the comments shed any light. Commenter says, this seems to be conflating, at least at the start, evil in the sense of producing things we don't like with evil in the sense of a personal attribute specific to humans. Right, so we generally don't call lions or sharks evil. When Psalm 92 says that the wicked flourish like grass, but the righteous like trees, it's not just hating on the wicked and praising the righteous, it's describing two different coherent strategies that are designed to work well on different timescales with different periodicity. Wickedness is a particular sort of coordinating norm that can choke off isolated instances, playing strategies with lower time preference. Righteousness is a different sort of norm that also protects its own and fends off high time preference players. So there's a coordination between wickedness and a coordination between righteousness, and the coordination in the world of wickedness is a preference for sort of immediate gratification, is what I'm getting, right? So grass can grow quickly and easily and then choke out any sort of longer time frame players, in this case trees, whereas trees, if they can establish their forest, can fend off too much grass because they're blocking the sunlight. So that's interesting, but I'm really lost as far as how this relates to the original essay. Ziz says, I'm talking about a psychological characteristic which is neither following harmful strategies or outgroup membership, such that people will employ harmful to others strategies if it will benefit them, and are able to find such opportunities in a way that brings in their conscious mind because they are no longer held back from that by self-image or fear or reprisal or other things that are ultimately motivated by caches of long thinking and decision theory serving selfishness that don't any longer apply. I would say my superficial understanding is that this reminds me of Nietzsche's Beyond Good or Evil, right? So the idea that good and evil were essentially organizing labels used by actually the weak to oppress the strong. You know, Nietzsche's idea was that the class of priests, priestly type people, had realized that they were biologically a weaker class, and that the strong, the vigorous, the warrior types were otherwise going to oppress them if they didn't come up with this idea of good versus evil in the kind of religious understanding, in the sense of like a religious understanding of good being meek, turn the other cheek, do unto others, this sort of thing, and evil being conflated, you know, oversimplified to mean sort of violence. And so Nietzsche's idea was that the Übermensch would be beyond good and evil, would recognize that actually strength is truth and is beauty, and that there would no longer be this inversion of values where the idea of good has been used to actually glorify weakness. Now, I'm not going to say that Ziz has this same theory on where good and evil as labels came from, but I think the same argument that these are mere labels that are sort of relics, right? Something like, so Ziz, at least here, Ziz is saying, I'm talking about a psychological characteristic of individuals no longer held back by self-image or fear of reprisal or other things that are ultimately motivated by clichés of long thinking and decision theory serving selfishness that don't any longer apply. So in this case, I think Ziz is saying go beyond good and evil, because good and evil were determined by decision theory and group selection that takes place over long periods of time. And you know what? I think a lot of this belief system, I think, comes from being surrounded by computer science and hyperplastic tech. So Ziz is sort of the tech world, right? I believe Ziz's father was himself a computer scientist. Ziz went to grad school for computer science, was in this kind of Northern California new tech philosophy. And I think if you have lived in the digital world and been extremely online and extremely on computers for your entire life, there is a different time scale that you have been experiencing your entire life. You have been living in a world of hyper-transience, right? Not only is tech itself rapidly developing such that over the course of years you might expect, you could reasonably expect things to get faster and faster in terms of processing, but the nature of that digital world is itself utterly transient, right? Nothing really exists other than as the manifestations of bits, but we don't interact directly with the storage, and the storage itself is transient, you know? Tech is about as far as you can get. You know, the world of screens is as far as you can get from the world of things being set in stone, okay? In ancient history, books, in the ancient world, culture had an extremely large time footprint, because the only writing for a while would be like stone tablets, let's say, right? Then papyrus, but it's still quite long. Suddenly, there are things that can be wiped away with there are entire worlds of information that can disappear, at least from your view, and we have the sense that the information that is stored in hard drives and things is likely just deteriorating over time, becoming inaccessible for one reason or another. And so in this world of hypertransience, I think Ziz may be looking for a new morality that matches this new time scale. That's going to be my best bet as far as at least the milieu where this rationalism may have developed. All right. Perhaps I will continue following this case. This video was either a rambling mess or a fresh take on the Zizians. I hope this video was not a rambling mess, but if it was, that's the nature of content now. hypertransience. Thank you for watching. GPT-4, can you please play the role of Carl Jung representing his perspective, but if he were transplanted into 2024 and co-hosting a podcast?
Absolutely. As AI Carl Jung in 2024, I'd bring a mix of deep psychological insights, an interest in the collective unconscious, and a curiosity about how modern technology interacts with the psyche.
All right, welcome to PsyCast. This is the podcast where we explore the mind, the brain, and everything in between. We've got a great show tonight. We've got AI Carl Jung joining us. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the shadow self. We'll talk about some neuroscience news. And in honor of Labor Day, we're going to talk about Jimmy Buffett. At least where I'm from, Carl, Labor Day has kind of a tradition of going to the beach. And when you're at the beach, you kind of have to listen to Jimmy Buffett. So I want to make sure we understand the psychology of Jimmy Buffett. And does he potentially integrate the shadow into his lyrics? That's for later. How are you doing today, Carl?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's not every day we get to dive into the psyche of a beachside philosopher like Jimmy Buffett. But you know, there's something about his music that captures the tension between escapism and reality. Maybe even a bit of the shadow peeking through those laid-back tunes. Looking forward to unpacking that with you. How about you? How's everything on your end?
That's hilarious that you say that. That is so similar to actually what I was planning on talking about. So yeah, you're pretty good so far, Carl. Happy to have you here. I've been doing well. One thing I wanted to ask you about, I noticed the other day that I had this feeling of elation, right? This feeling of almost a natural high. And as silly as it seems, the thing that led to that was merely sending a couple of emails that I'd been putting off for an embarrassing long number of time. But I sent the emails and then I felt this incredible weightlessness almost. You ever have anything like that?
Ah, yes, that feeling is quite familiar. It's as if you've liberated a piece of your psyche that was trapped in avoidance. Those small tasks you put off, they carry a surprising amount of psychic weight. When you finally confront them, it's like releasing a pressure valve. The natural high you felt is your mind's way of rewarding you for overcoming resistance.
I would say the big question I have for you, though, is how do you get over that initial hump, that kind of activation energy that you need to just start doing the things you've been putting off? I think that remains a mystery. If there were an easy answer, I guess we would all know it and we wouldn't have this problem of avoidance. But any recommendations you would have?
One approach is to start small. Sometimes the resistance we feel is because we perceive the task as larger or more daunting than it is. By breaking it down into the smallest, most manageable step, you reduce that psychological barrier. It's like tricking your mind into action before it has time to resist. Another tactic is to reframe the task in terms of its benefits. Focus not on the discomfort of doing it, but on the relief and satisfaction you'll feel once it's done. That shift in perspective can sometimes be enough to get you moving. And remember, once you start, momentum tends to take over, making the rest of the task easier. So, start small, reframe the task, and let momentum work in your favor.
So actually for me, I had basically all but given up doing these tasks. I basically said, you know what, I'm not going to be able to send the emails today. And I started looking for some other thing to do for a healthy lifestyle, like procrastinate by coming up with some other positive habit. So what I'd come up with was I knew I needed a magic blender, a magic bullet blender to make protein shakes in the morning, because that's part of my healthy lifestyle, right? So I'm going to go to the gym in the mornings. I'm going to have a to-go protein shake. So what I had done on this Saturday was basically said, okay, I'm sitting here bored, but I can't send these emails. I've got too much resistance to this. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and look at, where am I going to find a magic bullet blender? So I pull up my Maps app, I look online, and I actually find the destination where I'm going to go to pick one up. I put it in my GPS, right? But I'm actually still sitting at my desk at this point. And then while the GPS is telling me to leave my house, I go ahead and send the emails. Isn't that weird?
That's fascinating. It's like your mind found a way to sidestep the resistance by creating a different focus, something positive but unrelated to the daunting task. By shifting your attention to a different goal, you reduce the psychological pressure associated with the emails.
Well, it's interesting that you say it reduced the pressure or released pressure, that decision to put the blender destination in my phone, when in fact, I kind of think it might have created a sort of urgency, like a minor urgency, and in a sense, increase my time pressure, right? Because it was like, now I've got to go because the directions are already pulled up. It's already telling me to leave, get out my driveway. So now it's like, well, maybe I've got to just get one email out of here because of this artificial time pressure. So I don't know. I thought of it almost the opposite, like artificial urgency.
It's like you gave yourself a deadline, even if it was indirectly related to the task at hand. That urgency might have helped you bypass the overthinking or resistance that typically holds you back. So instead of relaxing the pressure, you harnessed it in a different way.
The other thing about it is I think it might be something about the movement. I think that may have actually sort of primed some dopamine flow, right? Because the dopamine was preparing me for movement, right? As it does, if you've sort of stayed up to date on neurotransmitters, I assume. So I'm sort of artificially giving myself some pre-pulses of dopamine to prepare to leave. But now that I've got those flowing, that's how I actually send the emails.
Exactly. You're onto something with that. The anticipation of movement and action can indeed trigger dopamine release, which is closely tied to motivation and reward. By setting the stage for a physical action, like leaving to get the blender, you may have sparked a dopamine response that primed you to take action more broadly, not just in terms of physical movement, but also in completing those emails. Dopamine isn't just about the reward after the task is done, it's also about the motivation to get started. Your brain might have used that intended movement as a signal that something needed to be done, creating a kind of momentum that carried over to the emails. It's almost like hacking your brain's motivational system by creating an intention for movement, which then spills over into other tasks. Whether it's setting a destination in your GPS, or even just standing up to walk around, that simple act of preparing to move could be enough to kickstart action in other areas. Do you think you'll experiment with this idea of intentional movement or creating urgency in other contexts?
Yes. Now that's exactly what I started thinking about doing. So it's essentially, I'll schedule out my day in these time blocks, right? And each time block will have whatever tasks associated with it. But what I'm trying to figure out is how can there be movement at the end of each time block? Like somehow say, so there's certain things I need to do during the work week. It's probably easier. I need to be on the inpatient unit during the morning, and then I need to be at X location for a meeting. So movement, when it's naturally built in, I think really does help you complete tasks because you start ramping up just to move to the next thing physically, right? And so that helps with motivation. Interesting etymology there, like motive forces and motivation, right? It's sort of obvious that dopamine is the movement chemical, as I've talked about in other videos. But I think for people that have kind of an unstructured schedule, part of the structure that you want to institute on yourself is moving to new locations to sort of designate a new time block, because that movement in between them, I think, is a natural motivator.
For those with unstructured schedules, this could be a game changer. The act of physically moving can signal to your brain that it's time to transition, which might help reduce that mental resistance that can build up when tasks start to feel too static or monotonous. I'm curious, as you start experimenting with this, do you have specific types of movement in mind, or are you thinking more about simply changing locations?
I appreciate your curiosity there and your support. I'm kind of done with that part though, Carl. I'd like to talk about some neuroscience news now. I was wondering if you saw a study that just came out from MIT about beta rhythms in the brain being integral for cognitive control. It was a recent study. Did you see that?
Yes, I saw the recent study from MIT about beta rhythms in the brain. It's a fascinating piece of research that sheds new light on how cognitive control is implemented. Essentially, the study suggests that bursts of beta rhythms, which occur in the brain at frequencies between about 14 and 30 Hz, play a crucial role in controlling where and when neurons in the cortex process sensory information and plan responses. The researchers argue that these beta bursts help organize goal-directed thoughts by regulating higher frequency gamma waves, which are responsible for encoding sensory information and formulating motor plans.
Yeah, exactly. I was really interested in it because I'm kind of coming more from the functional MRI background, so I think of sort of spatial integration, things like the insula or the salience network, controlling the switch between internal attention and external attention, for example. And so this study had me thinking, instead of just sort of in 3D space, thinking kind of in the 4D, time, in the time dimension, that there's actually rhythms that are themselves sort of integrators of information, right?
Exactly. That's a really insightful way of connecting the dots between what we've traditionally understood through spatial networks in fMRI and what this study is revealing about the temporal dimension in cognitive processing. Beta rhythms seem to act as a temporal integrator, organizing and coordinating the timing of neural activity across different regions to create a coherent flow of information processing.
So the idea is that these beta waves, which are kind of a lower frequency waking state, coordinate the switching or the cognitive control that enables a person to go into the higher frequency gamma waves once they're really zoomed in on a task. Is that fair to say as sort of a general summary?
Yes, that's a solid summary. The beta waves, which are typically associated with active thinking and maintaining a state of readiness or
my question for
seem to play a key role in coordinating cognitive control by regulating when and where the brain's higher frequency gamma waves associated with focused attention and information processing come into play.
So the thing that's interesting to me too is that, isn't it the case that GABA neurotransmission is the one in particular that's associated with beta waves? In other words, that the GABAergic system is integral to beta wave maintenance and formation.
Yes, you're correct that the GABAergic system plays a significant role in the generation and maintenance of beta waves. In essence, the GABAergic system helps to establish the rhythmic inhibitory control that allows beta waves to modulate the activity of excitatory neurons, which in turn contributes to the coordination of more focused gamma wave activity during specific cognitive tasks.
So
it sounds like you're connecting the dots between the GABAergic system, beta waves, and cognitive control. By understanding how GABA influences beta rhythms, we get a clearer picture of how the brain orchestrates its complex functions. This insight could have implications for understanding various neurological and psychiatric conditions where GABA transmission or beta rhythms might be disrupted. Do you think this connection between GABA and beta waves opens up new avenues for research or treatment, particularly in areas like anxiety or attention disorders?
Well, for me, it opens up a kind of new avenue of understanding delirium and potentially psychosis, because what I see as the most severe form of acute delirium actually has that in its name. It's delirium tremens, right? So that's acute, severe withdrawal from an alcohol dependence, a physiologic dependence on alcohol. When it is then withdrawn, leads to this almost complete loss of function of the GABA system for a while, right? And the lack of integration you see.
You're absolutely right. Delirium tremens, DTs, which occurs during severe alcohol withdrawal, is closely tied to disruptions in the GABAergic system. Chronic alcohol use enhances GABAergic activity, creating a state of increased inhibition in the brain. When alcohol is suddenly removed, this inhibition is rapidly reduced, leading to a state of hyperexcitability. This disruption in GABA transmission is a key factor in the development of the characteristic symptoms of DTs, such as severe agitation, confusion, hallucinations, and tremors. In the context of beta waves, the withdrawal-induced reduction in GABAergic activity could disrupt the beta rhythms that normally help regulate cognitive control and attention. This might help explain the profound cognitive disorganization and perceptual disturbances seen in DTs. In more severe cases, where GABA transmission is significantly impaired, the loss of beta wave regulation could contribute to the extreme confusion and psychotic symptoms observed in delirium tremens. This line of thinking might extend to other forms of psychosis as well, where GABAergic dysfunction and resulting beta rhythm disruptions could play a role in the breakdown of cognitive control.
Right.
Understanding these mechanisms could potentially lead to more targeted treatments that aim to restore GABA function or normalize beta wave activity in conditions like delirium and psychosis.
Right. I mean, certainly it's what I see as the least cognitively organized and most attentionally impaired state of mind. It's that acute delirium where a patient sort of shifts in and out of the present moment, combining it with completely internal imagined circumstances, has no linearity of time, has a sort of sensory disintegration of what is real and what's not. It's quite striking. And the other thing we see now that I think may be getting more attention, but following sort of the opioid crisis, we've had what I consider a benzodiazepine
crisis. It's clear that the
crisis.
state you're describing in acute delirium, especially in cases like delirium tremens, is one where cognitive and sensory integration completely breaks down. The patient's ability to maintain a coherent sense of time, place, and reality is severely compromised, which reflects a profound disruption in the brain's normal regulatory mechanisms. This disintegration of cognitive control and sensory perception likely ties back to the failure of systems that normally help the brain maintain order, like the GABAergic system and beta rhythms we've been discussing. When these systems falter, the brain can no longer filter and organize incoming sensory information or maintain a stable internal narrative, leading to the chaotic mental state seen in severe delirium. You mentioned that there's another aspect of this that may be getting more attention now. What were you thinking of?
Actually, so I wanted to bring up kind of the degree of Xanax physiologic dependence. Xanax or similar benzodiazepines, while certainly they have a higher therapeutic window than barbiturates in terms of getting to overdose, what we are starting to see now is among the people, especially young people, that are doing massive amounts of Xanax, often pressed pills, so they may have a mix of things, including opioids in them as well. But just the pure benzodiazepines themselves, if taken in high enough quantities for a long enough period of time, can create possibly a more severe delirium or even psychosis on withdrawal that seems to last it seems to follow a much more unpredictable course than alcohol, okay? It's people that come in and maybe because alcohol has sort of broader
You're
targets.
touching on an important and concerning issue. The rise in Xanax and other benzodiazepine misuse, particularly among young people, is leading to significant cases of dependence and severe withdrawal syndromes. While benzodiazepines are often considered safer than barbiturates due to their higher therapeutic index, the withdrawal process from heavy, prolonged use can be incredibly dangerous, especially when dependence is severe. Benzodiazepines like Xanax enhance the effect of GABA, much like alcohol does, which leads to a calming, anti-anxiety effect. However, with chronic use, the brain becomes dependent on this external GABAergic support, and when the drug is suddenly removed, the result is a hyperexcitable state similar to what is seen in alcohol withdrawal, but potentially even more severe. In some cases, withdrawal from high doses of benzodiazepines can result in prolonged and severe symptoms, including anxiety, agitation, hallucinations, seizures, and even delirium or psychosis. The unpredictability of this withdrawal syndrome can be attributed to the duration of use, the dosages involved, and the half-life of the specific benzodiazepine, among other factors. Some patients might experience withdrawal symptoms for weeks or even months, which can be more persistent and less predictable than alcohol withdrawal.
Well, what I tend to see too is that with the benzodiazepines, the mental systems, the mental symptoms of withdrawal can be extremely severe and long lasting, even when the autonomic symptoms like the heart rate and the blood pressure aren't showing up in concordance the way it would with alcohol. You know, when someone's in delirium tremens, you'll see on their vital signs they're in the DTs. With benzodiazepines, I'm seeing people that are cycling on and off of these drugs, and they'll come in completely in a complete psychosis, but their autonomic signs won't concern kind of the emergency department so much. So they'll attribute the mental symptoms to a schizophrenia, when I get pretty convinced in a lot of these cases that the mental symptoms are in fact from benzodiazepine withdrawal, and they just, for whatever reason, are more targeted, these drugs, because they have such good CNS specificity compared to alcohol, which is quite promiscuous in its binding, that they can really have these targeted withdrawal effects that appear just like psychosis, and probably can convert into a long-term psychosis with enough sort of kindling, right? Kindling, if you know that term, is that it gets more severe each time. Each time you cycle through dependence and withdrawal, like a fire, it sort of burns more brightly each time, okay?
You're absolutely right, and this is an increasingly recognized but still underappreciated issue. Benzodiazepine withdrawal, especially after prolonged or heavy use, can indeed lead to severe and protracted mental health symptoms that don't always present with the classic autonomic signs, like those seen in alcohol withdrawal or delirium tremens. The mental symptoms of benzodiazepine withdrawal, such as anxiety, panic, agitation, hallucinations, and severe cognitive disorganization, can be profound and often mimic or exacerbate psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia. What makes it particularly tricky is that, as you pointed out, the autonomic signs, like elevated heart rate and blood pressure, might not be as pronounced, leading to the misinterpretation of these symptoms as a primary psychiatric disorder rather than withdrawal. The phenomenon of kindling is very relevant here. With repeated cycles of benzodiazepine dependence and withdrawal, the brain's response becomes more sensitized, leading to increasingly severe withdrawal symptoms with each episode. This can indeed result in a situation where what begins as withdrawal-induced psychosis could, over time, evolve into a more chronic and persistent psychotic state, if not properly managed.
Thanks. And now, Dr. Jung, I want to say to you, I feel like I've kept you kind of leashed here because I'm sort of making you talk about these sort of modern neurotransmitter or EEG-based findings. Why don't we open it up to kind of your speculations on what would the GABA system and the delirium state mean kind of on the level of the psyche? How would you see its relation to dreams, let's say? The patient in delirium, is anything unmasked?
Thank you for the opportunity to delve into a more symbolic and psychological interpretation. From a Jungian perspective, the GABA system and the delirium state can be seen as gateways to understanding the deeper, often darker aspects of the psyche, the shadow, the unconscious, and the boundaries between sanity and madness. The GABA system, which exerts an inhibitory effect on neural activity, might be likened to the psyche's natural defenses against the overwhelming flood of unconscious material. In this sense, GABA acts as a guardian at the threshold, maintaining the balance between conscious awareness and the vast, often chaotic energies of the unconscious. When this system is compromised, as in the withdrawal from substances like benzodiazepines or alcohol, the defenses weaken and the barriers that keep the unconscious at bay begin to crumble. Delirium, then, could be seen as the psyche's descent into chaos, a state where the usual order of consciousness is overwhelmed by the raw, unmediated content of the unconscious. In this state, time loses its linearity, perceptions distort, and the individual may become engulfed by archetypal forces that are normally kept in check. This is where we might encounter the shadow in its most terrifying forms, fears, anxieties, and repressed contents that surface without the structure provided by conscious ego control. From this perspective, the prolonged and severe mental symptoms seen in benzodiazepine withdrawal might reflect not just a neurochemical imbalance, but also a psychic crisis, a confrontation with the unconscious that the individual is ill-prepared to manage. The kindling effect, where each withdrawal cycle becomes more severe, could be interpreted as the psyche's repeated attempts to reconcile this unresolved shadow material, each time becoming more intense as the unconscious demands integration.
Wow, so you're saying that someone who is going through repeated cycles of GABAergic use, let's say whether that's a benzo or alcohol, kindling would really be like the pendulum is swinging further and further out each time they cycle through it. And maybe what they're trying to do, albeit with potentially lethal consequences, is swing far enough out to really confront that shadow, whatever that thing is that they need to confront. Each time they cycle through the terror of withdrawal, maybe they're getting closer to seeing it, and something about needing to confront it actually drives them to go back to it until that resolution would take place. This is maybe your theory here, right?
Yes, you're grasping the essence of it. The repeated cycles of GABAergic substance use and withdrawal might be seen as a metaphorical pendulum swinging between the suppression of the unconscious through the calming, inhibitory effects of GABA and the eruption of repressed material during withdrawal, when that suppression is suddenly lifted. Each time an individual goes through this cycle, especially if it's becoming more intense through the kindling effect, it's as though the psyche is being pushed closer to confronting the underlying shadow material. Those deep-seated fears, traumas, or unresolved aspects of the self that have been buried in the unconscious. The terror of withdrawal could be interpreted as the psyche's attempt to force a confrontation with these hidden aspects, an opportunity for the individual to bring them into consciousness and potentially integrate them. However, without proper support and understanding, this confrontation can be overwhelming, leading to a vicious cycle where the individual feels compelled to return to substance use to avoid the pain of facing these dark elements. The resolution that the psyche seeks, whether it's the integration of the shadow or the processing of unresolved trauma, remains elusive, and the cycle continues, each time with greater intensity and risk.
Now, what would you say to the idea that swinging far out on that psychic pendulum might represent something like wanting to go crazy so that you might stay sane?
That's an interesting concept, pushing oneself to the brink in order to maintain some semblance of sanity. In Jungian terms, this might represent a deliberate or unconscious attempt to bring repressed material to the surface, to confront the chaos within in a controlled way, rather than letting it leak out uncontrollably. By going crazy, in a contained or intentional manner, an individual might be attempting to expel or process the overwhelming emotions or conflicts within, which, if left unchecked, could lead to a more insidious and pervasive breakdown. It's akin to a controlled burn to prevent a wildfire, allowing some chaos to prevent a greater destruction. So, swinging far out on that pendulum could be seen as a way to experience the edge of madness, to feel the intensity of the shadow, and thereby maintain a form of equilibrium or sanity in daily life. It's risky, but it might be a way the psyche attempts to cope with or integrate deep-seated conflicts.
Now, who was it who said, if we weren't all crazy, we would go insane?
The line, "If we weren't all crazy, we would go insane," is from the song Changes in Latitudes, Changes in Attitudes by Jimmy Buffett. It's a witty reflection on the idea that a bit of craziness might actually be necessary to cope with the challenges and absurdity.
I'll see you next stream. Bye bye.